My name is Theo Gonzalez. Welcome to Viral Histories, Stories of Racism, Resilience, and Resistance. We're exploring some of the voices from the Asian American community and their response to this global pandemic. Today, we'll be talking with Max Leung, the founder of the San Francisco Peace Collective. He and his group have been conducting civilian patrols of that city's Chinatown, which is about 24 city blocks. My co-host for the series is Lamtaro Donovan, who is a high school student in Maryland.
Hello, America. Break your back for dollars, they don't carry ya. 7,000 miles away from home with language barriers. Land of opportunity. Tell me, is it good to you?
Thank you, Max, for joining us. And what we'd like to do is to ask you, how did you start this idea? How did this idea of the Peace Collective get started?
First of all, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. The idea, actually, the idea started a few years ago because in San Francisco, there's been a history of violent attacks, against the Asian community, because the Asian community were often targeted for robberies and burglaries. So a few years ago, I had the idea of, just organizing the community, because I noticed that in the Asian American and in the Chinese community in San Francisco, there really wasn't an organization or a voice, a singular voice that was representative of the community. Because I've been involved in different activists and social justice groups in the past, and I've always noticed that other communities always had a voice, and they were organized. The Asian American community, there just wasn't as strong a representation and voice, that I felt that we should have. I mean, considering that San Francisco is like 30% Asian American. It was kind of difficult at the time for me to spearhead such a project. I really needed, collective teamwork to make this happen. And it just seemed like nobody was interested. They would only be interested if somebody did all the work. And then a little over a month ago, once the shelter in place ordinance began, so I was on this Facebook group page, and this page was primarily about crimes against Asians. And I've been a member of that group for a while now. I would say like maybe 6 months at least. And membership in that group kind of hovered around, I think it was like maybe like 1,000 members in that group. And within a month's time, in this past month, membership shot up to over 30,000. So over 30,000 members. So membership was growing by 1,000 people per day. And so a month ago, I'm just scrolling through that group, reading the different articles and that people were posting, because recently there were a lot of attacks again in San Francisco Chinatown. And some guy posted, "Hey, who's in San Francisco and wants to patrol Chinatown?" And so I replied to him. A few other people replied to this guy, and we decided that we were going to go out and patrol Chinatown like the very next day. So the very next day, just a handful of strangers who met, on social media, met up in Chinatown, and we started patrolling.
And these are folks that you didn't really know before, and it's become kind of its own community, isn't that right? It's been great. Like friendships have been made. We've really gotten to know the Chinatown community a lot better as far as the merchants. We work closely with one of the merchants associations as well. And so really getting to know, and we've gotten to know a lot of the shopkeepers, on a first name basis. They recognize us now when we walk through the neighborhood. So, yeah.
So Max, your organization is an activist organization, and you guys patrol and protect the Asian American, Chinese American community in San Francisco. So what sort of response has that evoked from the police force?
The San Francisco Police Department is very supportive of what we are doing. Whenever they have information that they feel, might be of use to us, they contact us and they'll let us know.
What is the vision that you have for Chinatown after this pandemic?
Pragmatically, it's worrisome for me, just because I know that after this pandemic is over, and once things get back to normal or whatever, or the new normal, whatever that's going to look like,
Right.
I know that things are not going to be returned to normal for the Asian American community or Asians, all across, the world who, might be living, elsewhere. Just because I know that there's still going to be so much xenophobia and discrimination and prejudice and hate and fear, of Asians. So I know that it's going to be a major, economic impact on Chinatown. And as far as public safety goes, that's something that I'm worried about too, because once people are out and about again, that just increases the likelihood and the chances of, bigots and racists and, people of xenophobia, attacking Asian Americans. So yeah, I'm worried about what things are going to look like moving forward into the future, because Asian Americans or Asians not only have to deal with the same fallouts as everyone else, but they have to deal with that extra added dynamic as well.
What can our viewers do to combat this fear, this xenophobia that might very well linger after the pandemic?
Education, like educate people, let people know absolutely how absurd and nonsensical it is to point fingers or blame Asians for a virus, and also, I want everybody to be vigilant moving forward. It's not about living in fear, but just living in safety.
What is your vision for the San Francisco Peace Collective, and perhaps for a national peace collective once this pandemic is over? What role do you see your organization playing?
Like, my focus is just on San Francisco Chinatown at the moment, because, like I said, I know that other people, in other parts of the country, they're organizing their own communities, and that, for me, that's all I want to see, for people to, wherever they may be, to organize themselves and to protect their own communities.
Well, thanks, Max. You've given us a lot to think about, and including the model that your group has put together, which oddly enough is about strangers coming together for a common cause.
It's been a long time coming, just because, in the Asian culture, we're often taught not to be vocal, not to stir the pot, just kind of turn the other cheek, keep your head down, work hard, become successful, mind your own business. And now now is not the time for that. It's time for a cultural shift. And I do see that happening now with the newer generation of Asian Americans, where we realize that, it's, we need to create and build communities, to take care of and to look out for one another, and to also have a voice, to speak up for ourselves, to defend ourselves, and not be, and no longer be apathetic, and no longer just worry about ourselves, because, in the Asian community, you know, in the Asian culture, it's all about being successful, you know, and as we all know, there's no money in, you know, activism and volunteer work, so it's often frowned upon, you know, and we all have to remember that if it hadn't been for previous generations and ancestors who were activists and who made great sacrifices, like, we wouldn't have the privileges that we have today, you know, in society, in order to, you know, be successful, you know. So people had to fight and die for the freedoms that we have, you know, and so we can't forget that, you know, and so for future generations, you know, like, we have to do the same.
So thank you to Max Leung for joining us. He's the founder of the San Francisco Peace Collective, as well as our co-host, Lintaro Donovan. Please stay tuned for our live Q&A about this topic. It's happening at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thanks for joining us.
Hello, America. Break your backs for dollars, they don't carry ya. 7,000 miles away from home with language barriers. Land of opportunity. Tell me, is it good to you? But 6 feet deep in stolen land.
Hi, folks. My name is Theo Gonzalez, and I'm a curator at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. Thanks for joining us today. And this is the live segment of Viral Histories. In this segment, we hope you can ask some questions, dig deeper into the topic, and walk away with some new understandings of how the past can inform our present. For a lot of Asian American communities, there's nothing new in the notion of a crisis, of a pandemic. And what we're trying to do is to use the voices of the present to allow us to think about our historical circumstances. All throughout this week, we've got guests that will be with us. Today, you heard from Max Leung, who is the founder of the San Francisco Peace Collective. On Tuesday, we have a supervising nurse by the name of Abigail de Mesa, who is in New Jersey. On Wednesday, we'll have Russell Jung, who is a professor of Asian American Studies, and he's also the founder of a website called Stop AAPI Hate. And then on Thursday, we have Genevieve Villamora, who is the co-owner of a restaurant here in Washington, D.C. called Bad Saint. She'll be talking to us about what it means to own a restaurant and be part of the food service industry in the middle of this pandemic. So let's start off with some ground rules for our discussion. We'd like for you to send in your questions and comments to the chat box. For this program, we ask that you do not post any private or personal information. If you are a parent or a teacher watching with your students, we encourage you to actively watch with them. Also, please be respectful of those talking or sharing questions and thoughts in the chat. Listen with an open mind and assume the best intentions, as we are all in this together. We expect all comments to be respectful and appropriate. So all throughout this week, we have a special guest on the screen with me. Joining me today is Ruby Ibarra, who's a rapper, producer, and an activist. Ruby, welcome today, and could you introduce yourself to the viewers?
Hi, Theo. First and foremost, it's an honor to be here with you this afternoon. Thank you so much for having me be a part of this. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Ruby Ibarra. As Theo mentioned, I'm from the Bay Area, California. I'm an MC, a songwriter, and a lot of my music really, stems from my experience as a first-generation immigrant. So, hearing that and seeing that video and interview with Max, for me, it really, provided a sense of familiarity with a lot of the things that he talked about. And, like you mentioned, we're all in this together, and we're all learning as we, go through this shift of time, how time's been evolving in this just past year.
Yeah. So, Ruby, I'd like to get your thoughts on the video with Max Leung, who is the co-founder or the founder of the SF Peace Collective. He set up that patrol, that civilian patrol of San Francisco's Chinatown that was set up right in the middle of the pandemic. I lived in San Francisco for about 14 years off and on, and all throughout the 90s, and Chinatown is 24 square blocks. And he's telling us in another part of the interview that it takes him sometimes all day to do it. Sometimes he's got 10 to 15 people. What were some other thoughts about the video as you were watching Max's comments?
My initial reactions are, definitely I'm excited and happy to see the work that Max is doing for the San Francisco community and specifically Chinatown. As you mentioned, it does span so many blocks. So there's definitely a lot of people within that community that are directly impacted and affected by what's going on, especially the xenophobia that, we've seen rise in the last couple months. And I'm glad that he's using a sense of community in his actions, where he's allowing people to come together and to really rise up and to address the problem. Because as we see right now in this nation, we have certain people that have been using a lot of hateful rhetoric towards people of Asian descent. And it's important that we do have people that are working on the ground within our community that are making a positive change to combat a lot of the racism and stereotypes and a lot of the anxiety and fears that have also come with this.
Right. And Chinatown, of course, the San Francisco Chinatown is the oldest in North America and certainly one of the largest. And it's interesting that back in February of this year, February 29th, there was a massive rally that took place in Chinatown. At least 1,000 people showed up, and there were banners that were used as part of a major rally there. And on the main banner, it said "Stop the Virus," it was aimed to make sure that we were fighting the virus and not the people. There is a history of activism in the Asian American community, not just in the Chinese, but in Japanese American, Filipino American, Korean American communities. And so many communities, especially these immigrant communities, a lot of folks think that Asian Americans have really been passive or compliant, when in fact there's actually quite a lot of activism in so much of that history. Can you talk about that? Maybe some of the things that struck you in your own studies when you were learning about Asian American studies as a student?
What I did want to also note with Max's video is that I'm actually not surprised that it is in San Francisco that we have, we're seeing organizing like this happen there, because I think the Bay Area has always been one of the stomping grounds for activism. I mean, as far as I know, or what I've learned from taking ethnic studies in my college courses, was that even in San Francisco State, we saw early student activists rise for ethnic studies to be implemented in the program. And so we see this very diverse group of people who've always come together in the past. And it's important that we continue to uphold a lot of that history now, and to make sure that what Max mentioned earlier, not to spew hateful rhetoric and not to point fingers. And I think a lot of this hate that we're seeing is also driven by fear, anxiety, and misinformation. I think that we're seeing from the media, especially with social media being such a large platform now. I think it's important that we're cognizant of the information that we read, and more so the information that we share.
Yeah. Ruby, how do you get your information? How do you filter through the news these days?
It really is a challenge sometimes to filter through the news, just because with social media being so accessible, we see a headline and I think a lot of us tend to automatically want to click repost or like. And I think at the end of the day, what we all need to remember is to not only check our sources, but to also gather our information from multiple sources and realize what information is true and what information are based on, just opinion. And especially at times like this, where people are seeking updates on the current events and what the next 6 months or the next year is going to look like. I think that we need to be vigilant about the information that we share. And I think too that, when you read your news or details from multiple sources, we also need to recognize the hate language and recognize the effects of the language. For example, we've seen things like Chinese virus being used in place of COVID-19 or coronavirus. And I think, obviously that's very problematic and can be dangerous. And at times like this, we just really need to stand in solidarity with each other and be careful with the misinformation and really, stick with the facts and understand that everyone is affected by this. It's not just a certain group.
Right. Yeah, which is why those activists back in February said, fight the virus, not the people. We have a question that's come in. And are there organizations that are representing Asians that are pushing back to hold officials accountable? Are there any national movements? So it's a great question. I can think of a couple of ones. One on the government side of it. There's a congressional APA caucus within the House, and they've introduced statements to try to make sure to do the things that you've been talking about, Ruby, which is to make sure that we are being careful about our language, being specific about language, and they're trying to also think about this historically to understand how the notions of epidemics and pandemics have affected Asian American communities, especially in Chinatowns throughout the country. Oftentimes, ethnic enclaves have been the target for scapegoating at particularly these kinds of times. And if we go back a century, certainly in San Francisco as well. So in terms of political organizations, government organizations, there's CAPAC, Congressional APA Caucus. There are others that on Wednesday we're going to have Russell Jung, who's a professor from San Francisco State University, put together a website called Stop AAPI Hate, which was intended to try to document some of the incidents of hate crimes, everything from microaggressions to outright assault and battery. And so he's been able to collect somewhere around the order of about 2,000 incidents from around the country. And he's got some interesting things to say about how educators and community organizations are trying to organize around these issues, not just in San Francisco, but also in Los Angeles, Seattle, and Honolulu, and New York, and the rest. Ruby, have you come across any other organizations that are trying to deal with holding officials accountable?
Thank you for sharing those lists of organizations, because this is actually something that I've been, thinking of in the back of my head, because, as we see this rise in violence towards Asian Americans in this country, we also need to think about who are the people or what organizations are supporting those that feel like they don't have a voice. How about, let's say the elderly that don't have access to resources, whether it's a helpline or to, for example, Max's group that he started in San Francisco. How about those people? So I think it's great to hear that there are people that are actively, holding public officials accountable. I personally don't know of any, but what I have been happy to see recently is, I've been seeing journalists in the media, like with the president's, press conferences, that have been holding him accountable and have been asking not only the hard questions, but the important questions that need to be asked.
Right. Let's think about a couple things that came out of the video. And one was this, in an extended cut of the conversation that we had with Max, he referred to this idea of self-determination, the idea that, sometimes it's incumbent upon us to take care of our own communities. And so he referred to this term self-determination. And it's not just a new term, but it's something that goes back in Asian American history, but also goes back to a lot of other communities. I could think of Oakland in the 1960s and 70s, where people are trying to take care of young children. They're having soup kitchens that are open for workers, for the elderly. This notion of self-determination was really a major concept for a lot of communities across racial groups, across ethnic groups, and he's using it in a way to kind of think about this present circumstance. Sometimes in the middle of an emergency, it's incumbent upon us to think about doing for ourselves, and that involves, and for him at least, hitting the street. What do you think about that?
I like that concept of self-determination, especially in the context of now. Like I mentioned earlier, although there are groups that are holding public officials accountable, I feel like there still needs to be more. There still needs to be a lot more dialogue that needs to be had. A lot of problems, obviously, that still need to be addressed, and a lot of progress that still needs to be made. And so at the end of the day, I feel like it's really on us within our Asian American community to rise up and provide, whether it's resources, help, or safe spaces for one another. Because if we don't do it, the question of who's going to do it for us. But I think the best thing to do now is to strengthen our community, which is what we've been talking about, this afternoon. And I think that honestly involves not only creating safe spaces for everyone, but also educating one another, because of course education will always combat ignorance, and we need to continue having dialogue like we are now, Theo, and engaging in these conversations, and obviously be kind to one another during these times. And I feel like we should remember not to respond to hate with more hate. That's the bottom line. And I would like to see more helplines, to provide support, especially those that are more vulnerable in our community. And what I mean by that are the youth and the elderly. I'd like to think that, as public spaces start to open up, that we're mindful that they are the more vulnerable ones in our community. So maybe if that means helping groceries for elderlies that we know in our community, going out in public with them or for them, I think that could help out a lot. And lastly, I think also just checking in with one another. I think with this term social distancing that's come during this pandemic, we need to be mindful that means physical distancing, and it shouldn't mean that we're not checking in with one another. There's thankfully platforms such as FaceTime and Zoom and all these other virtual things where we can call the people in our community, make sure that everyone's doing okay.
Yeah. So we've got another question here, and it says, what resources do you recommend K-12 teachers explore to teach a more inclusive historical narrative, especially when these histories are not in the textbooks? We've got a fantastic resource throughout the Smithsonian that has gone live that is associated with this project, and it's the learning labs that anyone can access. So I'd urge educators and learners of all ages to explore what we have here at these learning labs, because they are really filled with educational resources, and they're modular. You can dip in and out as you need. You can share it. It's all at the click of these links, and we're constantly trying to improve them too. So if you can give us feedback about how else we can improve these things, it'd be wonderful. Some of them have static images, so you can focus on the image of a particular moment, a person, or an object that we might have in our collections. Sometimes there are articles. We also have a major trove of music as a result of the Smithsonian Folkways collection. So the learning labs are going to be available to anyone here, and I'd urge you to check those out and to make use of those. Great. Ruby, you've been active as a musician, as a rapper, performer for several years now, and I guess there are a lot of topics that you can discuss in your career, and it's interesting that your body of work has really dealt with certain themes about what it means to come to the United States as a young immigrant woman, relationships that you have with your parents, and what it means to be a person of color, a Filipino. Can you talk about how those themes are part of your own aspect of what it means to be an educator? In San Francisco, there was for many years a painter, an educator by the name of Carlos Villa, and he talked about street scholars, not the scholars in classrooms, but the folks that were on the streets, folks who could drop knowledge at the drop of a hat, and these were people who had much needed knowledge in the communities, and they were working in those soup kitchens and those libraries, some of them were working in prisons, but for him, street scholars were the ones who were dispensing real knowledge. And it seems if Carlos were still around here today, he'd probably turn to you and say, Ruby, you're doing this exact same thing as a street scholar. Can you talk about what that means to weave education and these themes into your music?
Weaving education and themes of identity, family, culture are all heavily embedded in all of the work that I do, whether I'm on stage or I'm writing my lyrics. And I think what these times right now are especially showing is just how important visibility and storytelling are. Because again, a lot of the things that we're seeing towards the Asian American community are driven by, people being ignorant and not knowing about who Asian Americans are and still continuing to see them as, foreigners or this perpetuate notion of the other. And I think this is why it's important that we see more Asian American representation in all forms of media, whether it's through music or film. And hopefully that's what I hope to achieve with the music that I do. Because for me, growing up as a huge fan of hip hop, the first teachers that I remember that in my recollection were artists such as Lauryn Hill and Tupac Shakur, who talked about their experiences. And I think when we talk about music, specifically hip hop too, this is the genre of the youth, and this is ultimately also the voice of the oppressed and the people who were from marginalized communities. And so I'm thankful to be an artist, to be able to participate in a genre like hip hop, where it allows me to not only share my voice and tell my story, but hopefully to inspire others to do the same.
Yeah. Ruby, we have a question that I think I want to direct it to you, because I think you might be able to get a handle on this. And it's related to K-12 resources. I am teaching high school students who are first and second generation Southeast Asian. What advice might you have for high school API students that are being exposed to being racialized for the first time? I mean, in many ways, it's one of your audiences, and they might be hearing your music as well. And they may or may not be getting some of those lessons in terms of Asian American history in their classrooms. How would you answer this question?
For me, I know when I was growing up, identity was the thing that I challenged. I tried to grapple with, most. It wasn't until I took ethnic studies courses in my university that I finally found literature. I finally found books and history that reminded me not only of myself, but the people that I was familiar with. And so I have been seeing a rise, specifically in California. I have been seeing a rise in, high school and middle school curriculum, including Asian American history. For those who don't have direct access to that, as Theo mentioned earlier, we have the Viral Histories website, which you can point your students to. And I think there's also a lot of, we're in a lucky time right now where there are a lot of novels and authors in our community that are doing the work, not only in fiction, but also in history. And at the end of the day, these are all very important works that we need to share with our students, especially in times like this, with Asian American youth, because if we don't know or understand where we came from or who we are, then it's going to be more of a challenge to understand how to navigate in times like this.
Right. Yeah, I can think of bookstores in the Bay Area like Archipelago Books that focuses on not just Filipino American, but also Philippine history, also Southeast Asian histories as well. They're carrying a lot of material that's actually geared toward K-12 folks or young adult novels or graphic novels, and it's just a great way to get into these histories that might be missing from our classrooms. Going back to that question, I couldn't agree with you more, Ruby. I think there are opportunities for a lot of our communities to always kind of think locally about what our issues are, what are these community issues, how are they affecting our particular block. And there's one group that I know of up in Madison, Wisconsin, by the name of Freedom Incorporated. And what's fascinating about them is they've been around for several years. They're focused on Southeast Asian communities, but they also understand that much of their history has a lot to do with the fact that they were situated geographically next to African American communities, working class communities, queer and youth communities as well. So they were always thinking locally about what it means to be Southeast Asian recent immigrants. But it also for them meant what kinds of stories do they share locally in that area of Madison with African American communities. So they're always thinking locally about their projects. You know, it wasn't just about their own group. They're paying attention to it, yes, but they're always thinking locally about what that means to be on that block, to be in that zip code, to be in that city, to be in that part of that neighborhood. And they're writing poetry, they're creating music, they're creating art for these very local audiences. And I think if there is a project, there's always a way to try to creative ways to tell those stories as you see it on your block. And I'm hoping more folks get a chance to do that. There are, of course, NEH grants that allow people to think about their local circumstance throughout the country. Let's think about this. Another question that's coming in is, as Asian Americans rally together to fight racism and xenophobia during this pandemic, how can Asian Americans support other communities of color? I think some of this we kind of touched on by thinking intersectionally, thinking cross-racially, cross-ethnically. But Ruby, what do you think about this as well? I mean, I guess a pandemic and emergency is probably one of the right times to think about this, but we should also be thinking about this even when it's not an emergency. How would you address that?
First, this is definitely a great question. And like you said, Theo, we need to be thinking about this even when we're not in an emergency. And this is something that I've thought about before, this pandemic. And, I just wanted to also mention that during these times, seeing the xenophobia in our community does make me anxious and fearful. And I can't help but be reminded of the times that our nation has targeted other specific groups during an emergency, whether that was, 9/11 with Muslims being vilified, or internment camps, Japanese internment camps after World War II. It tells me that there are very inherent structures within institutionalized racism, and it's cyclic. These stereotypes and racism towards Asian Americans have always been here for a long time. It's nothing new. I think it's just that it's continued to exist and now brought to public attention because of what's going on with the pandemic. And ultimately, I feel that what we can learn from this is that it's not right to target a group. And, because the target group, I feel like it's a variable. It could have been any group that people could have chosen. And as an Asian American, of course, during this entire thing, it's reminded me that the model minority myth is in fact a myth. And, in times like this, where we see people being vilified or having hateful rhetoric or violence acted towards them, it reminds me that, of course, we need to come together, but also that there, again, are a lot of problems that we still need to address, and that, like Craig Valdez mentioned, we need to stand in solidarity with other communities of color who face this on a daily basis. Because when this is all said and done, and let's say it is safe again for Asian Americans to be outside, what we need to think about, what are we doing also as a community to help those who have experienced this in the past and who will still continue to experience this even when this pandemic is gone. And I think ultimately what we need to do in order to support other communities of color is to learn from this situation, and understand that, when we hear movements like Black Lives Matter, that it isn't too far different from what we're experiencing now. And, we need to create a safe space. And what I mean by that is not just for our community itself, but for all communities, especially communities of color.
Thank you, Ruby. We'll be thinking about these issues in an intersectional way as much as possible, cross-racial, cross-religious, cross-ethnic, and I'm glad you brought up that topic of the model minority, because we're gonna try to explore that in the next few days. But what I want to do is to remind folks again that for the rest of this week, we have Abigail de Mesa, who is a supervising nurse in New Jersey. We'll be talking with her on Tuesday. On Wednesday, Russell Jung, who is a professor of Asian American Studies at San Francisco State. And we'll be wrapping up on Thursday with Genevieve Villamora, who is a co-owner of a restaurant, Bad Saint, here in Washington, D.C. On Friday, we'll be thinking about the work of Grace Leung, who is an author and who's been thinking about some very serious Chinatown stories that I think all of you will appreciate. Ruby, you want to have the last word as we close up? Oh, wait a minute. One more quick question.
Yep.
Who are the people who are most inspiring to you and why? Ruby, this is coming from Sofia Malatesta.
There are a lot of people who inspire me. I feel like it's impossible to achieve, your goals, or to be able to, especially as a person who is within, a certain career. It takes a village, as they say. And the people that I can think of at the top of my head are definitely the educators, my ethnic studies professors, who allowed me to open up my mind and, think not only think about my history, but also think about the intersectionality and think about other people's histories, and, how all of this are, come together, how we all can come together in this country. And, but that goes with saying, Dr. Don Mabalon, Dr. Alison Tintiangco Cabales, and of course you yourself, Theo. And I think in times like this right now, the people that are inspiring to me the most are definitely the frontline workers and the first responders who have been working around the clock to help ensure that we're all safe and, helping to move the community forward. And with that, I do want to say that I hope everyone continues to stay safe out there and continues to stay vigilant and be kind to one another.
Thank you, Ruby. Thanks for that. Great. Thank you again to Abby Pfisterer, Maria Sanchez, Eden Cho, Andrea Neighbors, and Amelia Grabowski for today's program. We hope you join us for the rest of the week on Viral Histories. Take care.